really very fortuitous for us in conjunction with the World Photo Exhibit, which we're happily hosting here for the second year, and hopefully will continue in the future. And last year and again this year, we have used the photo exhibit as the occasion for a variety of events, speakers, panels, and discussions. And this year, fortunately for us, the photo exhibit, I'm going to say quite coincides because it's a few months later with the arrival of a new member of the faculty here, and even more importantly, a person who has come here to build a new program, which we're very happy about, the program of public diplomacy, and I suspect we'll know more about it, much about it now as I do. And Nick Cull, who comes to us, as you will readily discover from him, is a historian of the media, a historian of propaganda, and a historian of the intersection between media and propaganda, and in that sense, very appropriate to talk about photojournalism, which is, I think, an often under-attended to dimension of the ways in which we learn about, accurately or inaccurately, the realities of other societies, or attempt to influence perceptions of ourselves in other parts of the world. So, before Nick expires or you're exposed too much to whatever it is that is doing it, so I can move out of range.
Yeah, that's right. If only I hadn't licked those ducks when I was in Saigon last week. You know. Yeah. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. Thanks, Larry, and nice to see some. Please sit down, be comfortable. You can come down here to the seats here. I hate to see people standing up because what I want to talk about this evening is the intersection of public diplomacy and photojournalism. But at some point, my remarks will move over into photography, because I think there isn't really a clear line between photography and photojournalism, or photography and the media and photojournalism. So I'm drawing the definition of photojournalism pretty widely to be photography in the public sphere. But I'll be looking at photography and photojournalism, and I will particularly be going through the power of the image. I'll look at the challenge that images present to contemporary public diplomacy, something of the history of the use of photography and photojournalism in American public diplomacy, and then I want to talk a bit about the potential of photojournalism as a mechanism for reaching out in public diplomacy. First of all, the power of the image. Those of you who have viewed the exhibition will have been reminded of the sheer power of photography to touch us, to inform us, to disturb us, and reach us. Photography is has a claim to be a universal language, a way of reaching beyond words to communicate its message to the audience. Photography is a technology that empowers the moment, takes a fleeting instant of time and turns it into something memorable, something powerful. When we think of history, we now visualize a succession of photographic images that have come to define whole eras. Photography provides a narrative in an instant. This picture, we look at it and immediately have a sense of the devastation that the tsunami brought to South Asia. Photography can trump text. Photography can replace text as the defining communication about a particular subject, a particular era, and I think that photography can, in fact, mislead without context. And a lot has been written about this, the way in which a particular image will become not just a way into thinking about a subject or a moment, but will actually replace analysis of that moment to become the totality of what we know about that. And the best example is, of course, the Tet Offensives in Vietnam in 1968. This photograph of a Vietnamese chief of police, General Lone, shooting a Viet Cong suspect in the head has come to represent not just the Tet Offensives, but the brutality of the entire Vietnam War. A little context starts to complicate the image. The man is not merely a suspect, but a terrorist caught red-handed. Members of Lone's own family had been killed that day. So the image is complicated. It's not just what you see on the screen. There's a story there that needs to be explored. We may still decide that the Vietnam War is, as this image indicates, something so brutal that we don't want to have anything to do with it and should never have been there, but we owe a certain level of exploration, of thought, before we reach that conclusion. We cannot just jump over analysis, as use of these photographs in rhetoric can suggest. 9/11 created a challenge for American images. Initially, the images of 9/11 worked for the United States. Around the world, people were profoundly shocked by these pictures of landmarks ablaze. But and the State Department built on this by almost immediately circulating an exhibition of 9/11 photography around American embassies in the world, and inviting people in to participate in the sort of the collective grief of 9/11 through the act of viewing these photographs. But of course, this would not be the end of images generated by 9/11 and the War on Terror which followed. Images can turn very quickly. This image, sent around the world following the American conquest of Baghdad, was disastrous, maybe the most disastrous image for the United States, other than the Abu Ghraib pictures. But the image of the American flag being placed over Saddam's face on this sculpture caused profound shock around the Arab world, because it turned what some people thought as America helping to get rid of an odious dictator into an insult to Arabs. It played into what Saddam had always been saying, that his war with America was about a confrontation with American imperialism. And this picture started to define America's actions in the Middle East, or spoke to those who would define America's actions in the Middle East as being a part of an imperial project. Other images followed which played into this framework of understanding. Around this time, I had a conversation with the official who was then in charge of British public diplomacy, and the photographs taken, the photographs from Abu Ghraib had just broken, and I said to the official, well, what do you think? How do you feel this morning? What have you been talking about at the Foreign Office? And he shook his head and said to me, why did she have to be called England? But these images circulate, and the world watches, and the world draws its own conclusions. And today, it's not just the images that circulate in the world's press that are the issue. Soldiers blog their own pictures of the war, posing with the dead as trophies, and are invited by a website called, a pornographic website. It allows soldiers free access to porn if they will email over pictures of atrocities and mutilated bodies, which they can exhibit. So, I mean, this is the problem. This is a story which both shocks by the images that circulate, and also shocks by the fact of the story. So I think in the situation we have at the moment is that peculiarly now images can circulate much more freely than before, and it's much harder to monitor images, much harder to shape images, and images which one really would not wish to be seen can be seen. And the army's trying very hard to clamp down on soldier blogs, clamp down on cell phones that take pictures. But we're in a world now where, you know, one's telephone acts as a camera, and one's camera acts as a telephone, and one's computer can talk to one's refrigerator, and so forth. This Bluetooth world is not something that bureaucracies have really begun to address and regulate. One of the images that's been circulating on the World Wide Web are these before and after shots taken by American soldiers. What do they show? Now, according to bloggers, they show a young insurgent shot dead, or maybe just a young Iraqi who's been shot dead by American forces, and then he's been implicated in the insurgency by having weapons introduced into the photo. And there's no dispute that this photo here was taken first, this photo here was taken second, and that there are a dozen other images of other dead teenagers in which arms have been introduced. And these images went right the way around the blogosphere as evidence that the American military was planting evidence on dead Iraqis. Now, the real story has been explained at this website, a State Department website which explains counters disinformation, which is not a very widely read website. But what actually happened here was that American soldiers shot insurgents who'd been firing at them over a period of some hours. Immediately after they'd killed them or downed them, they removed the weapons. They then recorded the scene. They weren't sure that the people were dead, and reintroduced the weapons only when they were sure that everybody was dead, to have a visual record of what each insurgent had been equipped with. And it's a standard procedure. You would not wait around on a battlefield taking photos until you're absolutely sure that there were no insurgents in the area, that nobody was going to come rushing back in and repossess the weapons. That's the explanation. But the explanation is much less powerful than the imaginary text created around these photographs. Photography has long been a part, and photojournalism has long been a part of American public diplomacy. Way back in the early Cold War, when the United States decided that its wartime information agencies would be preserved for the peace, agencies like the United States Information Service, photojournalism was one of the things that USIA was involved with. USIA distributed photographs in places where commercial photo agencies couldn't go. Now, this is a picture of Czechoslovakia. And when the newspapers didn't print American photos, well, they would be put in the windows of USIA offices so that people could queue up and look at images of world affairs, images of things that were happening in the United States. These were images of forbidden worlds. As part of cultural agreements, the USIA negotiated the right to distribute magazines, essentially modeled on Life magazine. This magazine is called America Magazine, and it would be sold on newsstands across Eastern Europe. And these magazines were incredibly precious. Their black market value far exceeded their face value, and were glimpses of life in the United States. USIA also circulated images of the enemy, images of atrocity. In this case, a summary Chinese execution of a peasant in the 1950s, Chinese communist execution. They circulated images of friends attempting to turn the Vietnam War into a story of GIs frolicking with happy Vietnamese children. Of course, nobody was buying this story. Photojournalism and state circulated photojournalism has its limits. USIA circulated evidence of dangers. Some of the most important photographs that agency circulated were the pictures of the Soviet installations in Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The CIA argued desperately that these pictures should not be released, that suddenly they thought the world would know exactly what a U-2 spy plane could see. But an argument was made in the executive committee of the White House, that the world had to understand why America was taking it to the brink of nuclear war. These pictures were released, and indeed the world did look on these pictures and understand. And it made an immense difference to a world understanding of American policy in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Images of leaders. Now here, in deference to the man who endowed this school, I should tell you a story about when Walter Annenberg was ambassador to Britain. And he was ambassador for Nixon. And the Nixon administration had an idea that for its public diplomacy, they would send out an exhibition of photos of the doings of President Nixon. And they required these photos to be in massive Hogarth frames, and they insisted that dignitaries from each country be invited to view this exhibition. And Walter Annenberg accepted this exhibition on behalf of his embassy, and the embassy staff, their hearts sunk, because they thought, oh my God, we're going to invite people in, and they're just going to be rude about Nixon, and we have to do this. And yet it's going to create negative press. Nixon's going to read it, and he's so vindictive, he'll cut our budget. Oh my God, what's going to happen? I'm going to be transferred to some god-awful country which probably doesn't even have a newspaper. What am I going to do? Somebody came up with a brilliant idea. They had an exhibition, but they labeled each picture not Richard Nixon meets Deng Xiaoping Richard Nixon meets Zhou Enlai in a diplomatic breakthrough, but this was labeled f-stop 6, 300th of a second, Hasselblad Mark III printed on, and they invited photographers. So each photograph was given a technical label, and only British photographers were invited to the exhibit, and it was a wonderful example of how American photographic technology was moving on and the state of the art of American news photography. So they turned a complete no-hope situation into a public diplomacy success. And there was one great photographic show, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. And that show was devised in 1955, and it was called The Family of Man. The Family of Man, created by the photographer Edward Steichen. And this show was so successful that its catalogue is still in print. And how many of you have copies of this catalogue? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You see, there's a reason why it's still in print. It's a wonderful book. For many people, it's the way in which they enter a lifetime relationship with photography and with the image. The Family of Man exhibition was designed by Steichen in conjunction with the Museum of Modern Art and the United States Information Agency. He went through millions of photographs, photojournalism, art photography from around the world, and picked out the pictures which he thought would communicate the message that he wanted. He whittled it down to 500 images which charted the breadth of the human experience. He designed a complex exhibition space, a three-dimensional exhibition space, so that the photographs would be rendered at a giant size and hung all around, sometimes on the ceiling, sometimes in alcoves, sometimes on the surfaces of pillars, so that you would move around within the photographs, and you would be confronted by the photographs alongside bits of text, elements of sacred text, but not only from religious works, but from the great works of literature. So you'd have the Bhagavad Gita in one room, and you'd have Thomas Paine in another room, and you'd have a Lakota proverb in another room, and you'd have Thomas Jefferson in another room, and an amazing Anne Frank in another room. An amazing experience. Family of Man showed 91 venues in 38 countries over a 7-year period. Millions viewed this show. It celebrated the common humanity. At a time when the Soviet Union claimed to have a monopoly on humanistic values, the United States showed that by showing the most common elements, life, love, faith, death, religious practice, that the United States could be associated with those humanistic values. So it trumped Marxist ideology. Among the images shown, this Dorothea Lange image of a mother during the Depression. The United States was prepared to show its poverty, its weakness, as part of this show. Bill Brandt's image of a girl performing the Lambeth Walk in London. And the final image, the walk to the Paradise Garden, an image of innocence, an image of childhood. Who could not be moved by images like these? Of course, there were critics who attacked the Family of Man exhibition, the most famous being Barth, who in his mythologies denounces the Family of Man in an essay called the Great Family of Man, for being abstracted from history. He wanted to know where was the historical connection with these images. But of course, that's the whole point. History in the 1950s was about the dialectic between the workers and the ruling classes. And if you'd started to talk about why the Dorothea Lange's people were poor and why certain people shown in the show were mourning their dead and why a soldier was dead on the ground in the Korean War, then you would just be telling the same old story, and a story which Moscow had already defined for many of the viewers around the world. By abstracting these images into a universal construct, into a universal experience, USIA, Edward Steichen, Museum of Modern Art, was able to reap immense value and associate the United States with some very positive feelings in its audience. Now, the show was given to the state of Luxembourg, the birthplace of Steichen, in 1965, and remarkably, the people of Luxembourg, the Audiovisual Center in Luxembourg, restored the exhibition and have remounted it in this beautiful chateau in the little Ardennes town of Clairvaux, and it reopened in 1994. It is now on the UNESCO Memory of the World Register as being a cultural site of unique and enduring value to all humanity. They've recreated the three-dimensional viewing space and everything. It's a remarkable place to visit. Now, it is still public diplomacy. However, it is public diplomacy for Luxembourg. Luxembourg is using the Family of Man exhibition to say, look, this country has created something of transcendent value. We brand our country as being about diversity, as being about cooperation and humanism and liberalism, and we compare Family of Man to the works of Goethe, to the works of Beethoven, to being about all mankind being as brothers, as one family, and that is, what Luxembourg's about, and it fits right in its new home. But my feeling was that it's a shame that the United States isn't really doing anything to touch this, either in artistic merit, in ambition, or in quality today. There remains a tremendous potential for the image in public diplomacy. This, after all, is a technology for reaching out, a technology for communicating shared humanity. The need is not for ideology in American public diplomacy, but for people-to-people contact. The key frontier here, I would say, is not America going around the world exhibiting images of the United States. But what I feel, is that we have a public diplomacy event here today. We have images being exhibited to the population of the United States. And for me, the key frontier in world public diplomacy is right here, right now, the American public. Whatever can be done, or things need to be done, to open up the experience of the world, not least the parts of the world which are experiencing the special attention of the present administration, open up those experiences to American opinion. Only then can the people have input into a foreign policy which would be, I think, a foreign policy generated by an informed public would raise fewer problems than many of the present choices that are being made. So the key frontier for me is the American domestic imagination, and photojournalism is one of the ways of reaching that. But what do we see? These images are on exhibit here, and they're magnificent, but too seldom, these sorts of images are not making it into the pages of our newspapers. Photo editors are very conservative. You look at the images they choose for the Iraq War, and they go for stock images. If I see another soldier against the sunset or soldier against a tank, you know, just looking out into the desert, I think I will scream. There's an immense variety of images available, but these are not being communicated to the American public. It is not the rest of the world who need a revival of the family of man. It is the American voter. We need to open our eyes to the vision of others, and photojournalism is one way that this can happen. As an example of what I mean and what I would hope and what I see as the potential for photography in public diplomacy, I want to look at two cases from the NGO field, non-governmental organizations. The first is a photo exhibit by a very talented photographer called Zalmaï Ahad, who did a show called Return to Afghanistan for the United Nations Commission on Refugees. Zalmaï, his professional name is just Zalmaï, was born in Kabul. He left as a teenager in the 1980s as a refugee. He trained as a photographer, and always he photographed in black and white. But when he returned to Afghanistan, he moved into color because he saw his country was awakening. So immediately you have this really powerful testament to his perception of what's happening in Afghanistan. Not George Bush saying, life's better there. It's more complex than that, but it's somebody from there who is responding. And here are some of his images. He does a number of these panoramas, which, as you see them in a show, kind of wrap round you, and you have a really quite uncanny sense of standing on the street in Afghanistan. There's our wonderful governor. Women going to school for the first time. A very moving image if you think what was experienced by Afghan women under the rule of the Taliban, and the persistence of poverty in Afghanistan. He explains, I felt that now, after such a long time, there was hope again for Afghanistan. It seemed to me that colours were returning and that they would be those of a peaceful country, and so I set out to find this hope with, for the first time, colour film in my camera. Now, I mean, that would be great public diplomacy for the United States, but instead this is a show that a UN agency has promoted. It did a successful European tour. It got picked up by the Lufthansa in-flight magazine, which is where I found out about it, and you can download these images from the web. You can buy his the photographic collection as a book, and he has subsequent exhibits as well, but I would commend his work to you. The other example I wanted to talk to you about was kids with cameras. This is the project featured in the documentary film Born into Brothels. Have you seen this? I know it sounds like a real film that you don't want to order this from Netflix. You're going to sit there and it's going to be incredibly depressing. But it isn't depressing. It's uplifting. It's a story of an American photographer who goes into the poorest parts, I think, of Calcutta, and teaches the children who are children of the sex workers in Calcutta how to record their own lives, and uses they teaches them to use cameras so that they can then sell the photographs to pay for their own education. And here are just some of the photographs that the children take with her after she's taught them. And since the film was made, all of the children featured in the film are now in permanent education. The film ends with some of them dropping out of school. They're now all in education, and a new generation of kids are being taught to take photographs. Now, a project like this, a Kids with Cameras project in Iraq, would be an excellent thing for the United States to show, or not, but it would certainly give you an idea of what's happening in that country, would express the feeling of those people, the experience of those people, and maybe it's a chance that you have to take if you equip children with the ability to record and to describe their world. And that's the end of the formal part of my presentation, but thank you for your attention. So we wanted to open it up for comments and questions. Yael.
When I was Googling to get another copy of Family of Man, I came across a site that said that they're now calling for submissions for the second Family of Man. Mm-hmm. And so they're I guess some organization, I'm not quite sure which one it is inviting people to submit photographs.
There's been various second Families of Man and sequels and attempts. Some have already been published, but it's an ongoing thing that people think of having a go and creating a follow-up exhibition. But it would be a really tough act to follow. But I would commend you to, if you're in Europe, take a trip to the Family of Man. It's easy to get to. It's a very nice excursion. And it's a remarkable experience. You just let those images wash over you, or check the book out of the library, look at them, and it's a remarkable cultural experience. Yes.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, you're talking sort of about public diplomacy towards the American public. And I see these images we have downstairs, and some of them are frightening and some of them are beautiful. But I wonder, do you have any ideas on how we get that to the general public? Because I don't necessarily think this is an elite thing, what's going on here, because it's on the University of Southern California campus. And I don't necessarily think a lot of the general public reads newspapers anymore. So what do we do? How do we get that to people so they see outside of the country?
That's a problem, isn't it? I think it's dangerous to underestimate the public, and that things like shows in libraries, and you'd be surprised how these things get around. But at the moment, even where people are looking at newspapers, even the people who do look at newspapers aren't being exposed to these images. So, well, it's not, in a way, it's not my problem. I'm not the person whose country is vilified around the world. Tony Blair, even though he's bombing Iraq, nobody throws rocks at the British Council. There's a world seems to understand that we are not exactly the same thing as our foreign policy. It's the United States that has a problem, and you ask, each of you should think about this. How do you open up? How do you open up the American experience? I think that, in a way, a documentary like Born into Brothels has done quite a bit, and it's circulating in places where I've never seen a documentary about essentially an issue of aid and development. Ritz cameras, for example, carry it on the counter as something that they're sponsoring, and so you can buy this DVD just in the where you get your film processed in your 1 hour photo thing. So there are all sorts of innovative ways in which it's possible to reach the public. I don't think there's any one answer, but I think there's a burden on this generation to start thinking about innovative ways in which that question can be addressed. Eitan.
My question deals with more general effects of movies, art, television on public diplomacy. You have made a distinction in assessing public diplomacy benefits between those who are behind a project or an exhibition and the benefits that someone is gaining out of it. For example, you talked about the exhibition, the photos from Afghanistan.
Yes.
Okay, and the sponsor is a UN,
UN
international organization.
Yeah.
So, and somehow you would say, maybe if the United States had done it, American public diplomacy would have benefited from it.
Yeah.
But I'm not so sure, because I think what is important in the exhibition is not who did it, but the results
No,
that come out of it.
absolutely.
And maybe it's even better
yeah,
for
no,
international, you know,
no, I
High
think-
Commissioner.
Of course you're completely right. And my point in showing those examples was that maybe what American public diplomacy should do is facilitate NGOs and say to, rather than cutting the budget to the UN, say, well, you know, wouldn't it be great if we threw in a little extra on condition that you use it for public diplomacy? Rather than say, what's the UN, as Richard Holbrooke did, the UN should have no public diplomacy of its own. This is pork in the budget, let's cut it out. The United States should see this as being something that plays into the greater good. So you're absolutely right. And I think that one of the reasons that Zalmaï is somebody that I include here is because his images changed my mind about Afghanistan. And I've got a pretty hard mind to change. But I was really knocked backwards by his decision to begin photographing in color. Such a profound thing for a photographer to do. And I was deeply impressed by an encounter with those images and the hope that he expressed in those images. So did you have a follow-up?
I think we have two channels here. One channel is who is doing it. So if an American does something that serves public diplomacy, okay, regardless content.
Yes.
And the other channel is content, regardless who is doing it. And I think both channels should be employed.
Yes, no, I think absolutely, and that's a very helpful distinction. Richard, did you want to?
Yes.
No, you're still forming. Okay. Who else wanted to come
But are
in?
you saying that both channels pursued at the same time are not beneficial?
Saying that we have two. I'm making a distinction to sharpen the potential for using different forms of art for public diplomacy.
Yes, here.
I've always liked sports photos and sports photography. Do those fit into public diplomacy?
I see no reason why not, but it you know, and sports images are used at the moment for American public diplomacy, but sometimes on the mistaken assumption that the world is fascinated by American sports stars. And whilst Michael Jordan may be universally marketable, other people are not, and there are some American sports that will be that are unsaleable internationally. So, photograph of Michael Jordan, great. Photograph of Reggie Bush, less marketable internationally.
But there's an interesting combination here of sports diplomacy
Yes.
and photo diplomacy,
Yeah.
because if you, for example, take a picture of the ping pong historical match
Yes.
between American and Chinese ping pong players, then you get a public diplomacy effect. You would recall that this was the first sign
Yes.
of a new possible breakthrough
Yes.
in the relations between the two countries, or Iranian and U.S. playing, I think it was soccer. or
Soccer,
something like
yes,
that.
yes, the
So I
soccer-
think here you can double
the
the,
soccer match.
effect.
But I
by
think there's
using
a
sports.
wider issue of American sports reportage, which, as a foreigner resident in this country, I should point out, as you've got the Winter Olympics coming up. The Olympics is not an event whereby the United States competes with the rest of the world. Other athletes deserve to be reported. You don't just say, and somebody else skied too, and the American came in second, but somebody else, won the race. But unfortunately, American international sports coverage tends to be some of the worst reporting that one finds, obsessed with the hometown story and the attempt to find human interest, and peculiarly reluctant to applaud the excellence of somebody who is not an American. And all the rest of, if you look at the Olympics in any other country, they will applaud others. They will not just fixate on the medal count for the South. Maybe there are a couple of there are a couple of other countries perhaps where I think where you get this kind of attitude, but nowhere quite like the United States. Sorry, you wanted to.
Well, one example I saw, there was a short track speed skater named Apollo Anton Ono. He's American and he's become real popular here. His image is on the McDonald's bags. But he won his medal because a South Korean skater had been disqualified. And so he was actually voted in South Korea as a terrible person, and he was actually voted to be worse than Osama bin Laden. And so I just thought it was an interesting
Yeah, no, of course. But at least South Korea had reported his name. Probably, the South Korean athlete is not somebody whose name we know. I don't know. I think that maybe it's not nice for me to beat up on American journalism, but I think American Olympic journalism is one of the, especially American TV Olympic journalism is one of the worst experiences you could possibly have as a foreigner trying to discern your own country in American Olympic coverage is a nightmare of alienation. Yes?
I think you bring up an important point with this, though. I mean, the American coverage is the way it is because it's what people want. And so I think part of it
it's
is
what the bosses think that people want. Nobody gives them a chance. You could build up a gallant Mexican into being somebody that people would want to follow.
Research is done by these corporations. I mean, I wonder if at some point people aren't consuming public diplomacy because there's not as much of an interest in the international affairs themselves. And so I think that you need to attack on both fronts, whereas you increase the interest in what's going on in the rest of the world. I mean, just showing the images can do that, but at the same time,
I think that two wars running concurrently would increase people's interest in world affairs, but somehow it hasn't worked out that way so far. You still on the Los Angeles news. If it doesn't happen in the Southland, it hasn't happened. It's sorry, Richard.
I'd actually liken that argument slightly to, well, women don't want the vote because they're not really voting much, and read the research, they haven't expressed an attitude, for example. Let's say talk 100 years ago, and that because so you talk about false consciousness and questions like that. So you might see that actually if coverage were provided, that people would become more interested. In other countries, certainly you do find interest in foreign competitors.
Yeah, including strong interest in American athletes because they're so good and their stories are so interesting. And you look at the way in which Europe has taken Lance Armstrong to its heart. I mean, there's no sense that this is an American. They love him because he is a great human being, and it is a great human story of universal value.
Except the French.
Except the French, yeah, but there you go. C'est la vie. What other thoughts or responses? Yes, Richard.
I thought you did actually. You made a telling point when you mentioned that the American soldiers making their own blogs. And the negative consequences of that. Obviously, we have the Lindy England pictures and things like that, but going a step further and generally finding that we assume that the blogosphere can open up debate, improve democracy, improve the value of the people. The fact that people are talking, you will get a better, more enlightened sort of discourse. And you made a very good observation by showing this, that actually you just get a pile of squaddies putting up their pictures, going, well, hey, here we are. And that is very ordinary, normal people, that without any malice.
Normal people at 19 years old.
Yeah. And that you will find the same sort of people in Iraq, in Russia, in Britain, in South America. But obviously, this has become foregrounded much more in the public sphere, I presume, in America, because of its more wired... more people are online, and more of the American army are online.
And more of the American army are in Iraq, so you're going to have more 19-year-olds with a sick sense. And we know that from in previous wars, in the Second World War, American servicemen regularly collected trophies from bodies in the Pacific Theater, and there's a Japanese monk whose job it is now, his personal burden is to go around military sales and memorabilia and military collections, trying to reappropriate Japanese body parts for burial back in Japan. And during the Vietnam War, the difference between the Second World War and the Vietnam War in terms of trophy collection was that in Vietnam, people didn't like it when their families sent home body parts. There was a woman in Philadelphia who nailed 5 Japanese ears on her door as a trophy that her son had sent home. But I did run across an American journalist reporting in Vietnam who, a young American soldier came to her and said, my girlfriend stopped writing to me And she said, well, why? Can you think, is there something you wrote to her in your last letter? And he said, well, there's nothing unusual in the letter, but maybe it was the gift. And she said, so the journalist said, well, and what was the gift? She said, well, the severed head of a Viet Cong. And, you'd think that's sick. Life magazine in 1943 has a picture of a girl writing back to her boyfriend who'd sent her the severed head of a Japanese soldier saying, Hamlet comes to the Bronx. And she's sort of looking at this skull and writing back to say, thank you for sending me the severed head. So soldiers will be soldiers will be soldiers, and they're going to send nasty stuff home. Today they're doing it electronically, and that is going to reflect badly for the United States and or any power who's...
Certainly, I remember reading in the Book of Kings or something that's being asked... one of the kings, probably David, asking for the foreskins of 4,000 Philistines and the like. So this it's not a new thing.
No, it's not unusual. It's part of how warfare is conducted. The problem is when a state makes an exceptional claim to morality and says that its soldiers are not out there as young men with varying degrees of varying inclinations, good, bad, and in between, but says that we are here representing good in the world, fighting evil, and absolute moral force. When you make that sort of claim, other sorts of behaviors have to be expected from your military, both in terms of, and the United States Army tries very hard to keep its young men in line, and it isn't just the United States. You look at how Canadian troops behave in Cambodia, you look at how the British Army has behaved in Kenya, and young men abuse less powerful people when they're put in a position of sudden power. The answer to this is either you don't send troops to do that sort of delicate social work, or you send them there and then get them out as soon as you can, or you police them very, very carefully, or you be careful about the moral claims you're making to being in a country, and because recruitment and training. Yeah, but I know that in Israel they've had very different experiences when they use 19-year-olds on a security checkpoint and when they use older people in their 30s. And there's much less friction when they use older people. It's something, young people are a very dangerous instrument of power. You were 19 once. You remember, maybe some of you still are. I wouldn't want to meet me at 19 with a gun, or particularly with a camera, yeah, now, yes, no, I wouldn't dream of holding such a thing. But what other questions or thoughts do you have, or responses? I'd be interested to know how you respond to these pictures. How much, to what extent do you think the pictures needed the captions? Some of them speak in terms of sports photography. The very memorable image of the little boy who came fourth in a wrestling match with 4 people fighting in it. That communicated to me instantly as I came 8th in a shot put match with 8 competitors. I knew exactly what he was feeling, and it's a wonderful, wonderful instant image in the sports category. But how did you respond to it, and what did you think about these pictures? To what extent do they need the context, or are they pulling against the context, or are they transcending it and communicating to you as universals? Were there any images where you felt that it really changed the meaning of the image to read the caption? Yes?
Well, there was this one picture downstairs. I looked at it first without reading the caption. It was just like a picture of an African-American girl. And so I was like, oh, okay, it's just a picture of an African-American girl. And then I read the caption, and it said that she was 14 years old, and she had been raped by some people from her village. And after reading the caption, it took on a whole new meaning for me, just because I looked at her and I saw she's only like a couple years younger than me.
Yeah.
And then I began to realize like why she looked the way that she did in the picture. So I found some of the captions really helpful.
Other responses?
Well, I think part of the beauty of the photos downstairs is that you want to know the story behind it. And that's why the caption is...
That's about engagement, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think and I haven't looked like at every photo and stared at it for 5 minutes because I'm like running through. But I think every time I like stopped and looked at a photo, I had to read the caption.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, what other?
There's some that stand on their own. I think the ones that capture my eye just from a pure aesthetic standpoint are the ones that are in kind of the back corner towards the offices where they have the black and white photos of the, I think it was summer games or it was a sports event, and it was the way that the photographer shot them. They looked sort of unreal. They look like models almost. There's a field hockey game. There's a swimming pool. And when you look at them, they don't look like real people. They look like models.
Yeah, well, the pictures of the amputee sporting events.
And things like that stand, I think, on their own. They don't need a caption so much. But then others, there are some from Iraq that you kind of need to know. There was one of the prisons, and it's got this guy in a cage, and it was horrible. Then you find out that the guy was endangering other prisoners, and he actually needed to be isolated.
But those are the sorts of images that can be damaging to American public diplomacy because you put an alternative caption on them, and they then have a very different meaning. As a British photograph of a factory in China circulated during the First World War with the label corpse conversion plant, German corpse conversion plant, Vinny Ridge, France. And a very, very famous institute, a very, very famous example of photographic photojournalism propaganda. Just give a completely different label, and it can be a devastating and memorable image. Yes, Richard.
Talking about moving really towards the malleability of the image, the movement of it from this fixed, true representation into the digital world. Most of us, I think many of us have probably seen that picture that we've got the two soldiers holding a placard with a kid, or one soldier. They've got a placard and there's a kid, and there's some writing on the placard, but actually you've got a website where you can go in and write your own text for the placard.
Oh, right. Oh, that's great.
But the first time I saw that picture, it was actually somebody had sent an email forward to me with something like, "I'm with stupid," and pointing at the Iraqi kid, or pointing at the soldier, I forget which. So there was some political comment in there already, and it was sent to me as if it was a real picture. And it was only about a week later when somebody directed me through a link, probably from Larry, towards the website where you're actually doing your own bit of bricolage. That I realised that actually somebody just taken that and circulated as if it were true, and this people's knowledge or ability to tell the difference between something that actually was the case and something that's just been made up is pulled into question by something particularly like this.
Yeah. No, we're only now starting to understand what the digital media means for photojournalism. You remember back in the Los Angeles Olympics where the Pulitzer Prize-winning series of sports photographs of the Los Angeles Olympics, but with the sky painted blue on one of the programs that was available at what was it called? The Photoshop. Yeah, just on the basic Photoshop program to make the sky a sort of a beautiful electric blue, because you didn't see many blue skies in LA in the 1980s, but especially not during the Olympics. But so there's a whole new question of ethics around photography opening up. Yeah.
The Los Angeles Times got their hand slapped big time by a photographer named Brian Walsky, who was in Iraq as a unilateral, and he sent a Photoshop altered photograph where he sandwiched two photos of a soldier stopping an Iraqi man holding a child coming towards him. And what he did was, the first photograph, his gun was down and the Iraqi man was coming toward him. The second photograph was his rifle was up and the Iraqi man was holding his child, and it was just a little bit more dramatic. And so he sandwiched the two photos together, and it looked far more menacing. It looked like the soldier was about to shoot the man and the kid. And the only reason he was caught was because one of the LA Times sister newspapers, I think it was the Hartford Courant, noticed that there was a broken urn that appeared twice in the photo, and it was a very alert reader. And so, Walsky did this big, he was found in Iraq, and he had been wandering around the desert for a month, and one of the other photographers that was sent to go get him and bring him back and let him know that he was fired, so he smelled like a goat and all that stuff. But anyway, so the LA Times, heart sank, because that was going to be their Pulitzer entry, for one thing. And seriously, it's the second time they've been burned on something like that. And Walski came back and he was fired. And there was this big article in Photo District News on him. And all of us who are news photographers at the time as well felt really sorry for him. It's like, okay, you made a bad judgment and error, and and you were really screwed up, and you'd been in Iraq, and okay, we'll forgive you for really screwing up, but you idiot, type stuff. Until we read this interview where he said, "I'd do it again." And
really?
Yeah, he said he'd do it again, and his rationale for saying that was because, well, he goes, if I worked for anything that Rupert Murdoch owned, they'd pay me double. And literally, and the rest of us kind of just turn around and say, you know what, forget it. We're not gonna give you any sort of slack now. But Photoshop is not just about making the sky blue or removing the offensive telephone line that's coming out of your subject's ear or whatever. It's now about how to make your photos more dramatic. And my biggest issue is how many times are people not caught? And how many photographs that are so compelling that inflame people are doctored. And it's so much different than the photograph of Oswald standing there with a rifle that everyone thought was the paste up, as of cutting out with an X-Acto knife, as opposed to like this incredible technology we have now.
Yeah. And
the Walski photo fortunately did not circulate around the world the way like the Abu Ghraib photos would have, but had it, the damage would have been...
Well, there was a case in Britain where there were British photos of British prisoner abuse that turned out to have been faked by reservists in Britain and sold to the newspapers. And it was some months before that the fake was identified, and they'd had inquiries, and British troops had been discredited, and all sorts of damage was done before it emerged that these were fake pictures. Just done in Britain, and it was amazingly small details that gave it away. Like the boots were different, the rifle was wrong, the truck was wrong. Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's what they caught the Rachel Corrie thing too. Was the skyline was different.
Sorry, Andy, were you gonna?
Oh, he has the.
I just pulled up the photos because this is one site that says it wasn't really that altered. Or it didn't really alter the context, although that could be argued, because it's the same basic thing, but I guess in the altered photo it looks like
he's
aiming at the guy, maybe, but really aiming at someone over there.
Photo District News.
It's a little bit, yes, it's a little bit, they have eye contact, and it looks a little bit more threatening. He's gesturing. There's communication between them, which isn't happening in the original. Well, I guess if people are already leaving, we ought to call. Is anything else that people would like to say before we draw this to a conclusion? But thanks for your attention, thanks for your contributions, and very nice to see you this evening.